Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending upon where you are. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I welcome you to our America at a Crossroads program tonight. We thank tonight's esteemed guest, the great public servant, retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, and our exceptional moderator, Larry Mantle. It is wonderful to welcome you both back to America at a Crossroads. Next Wednesday on September 13th, we're excited to bring back by popular demand two of America's greatest political analysts, Ron Brownstein and William Kristol, and conversation about what else the current political scene. Then, in light of all that's going on in Israel, we have created a special event program next Thursday, September 14th, with acclaimed New York Times bestselling author and journalist Yossi Klein Halevi in conversation with one of America's great rabbis, Rabbi Edward Feinstein. The topic is Israel's divided soul, is Israeli democracy at a breaking point? In light of the impending arguments about judicial reform to be heard in front of all 15 Israeli Supreme Court justices on September 18th, this program will not only be timely, but highly illuminating and important. The following week on September 20th, we will dedicate the entire program to talking about the changing demographics of the American electorate, and in particular about America's youngest voters. Our speakers will be three experts on that topic: documentary filmmaker Mac Heller, Democratic pollster Celinda Lake, and millennial expert Morley Winograd. You can register for all of our programs in the email you'll get after tonight's program. If you have trouble registering, don't sweat it. We can help you. Just respond to any email you get from me or David, and we'll give you instructions. We know there's a problem, particularly between Chrome and Eventbrite. So you might want to try a different platform like Safari. There's an interface problem that I'm having as well. We're trying to get it worked out, not always successfully. We have no control over that, but we can always help you. Now for a few more highlights, my colleague and friend, David Laird. David?
Thank you, Janice. It's wonderful to have our audience remain as committed and large as it is. Tonight on a summer evening when there are lots of distractions that could lure you away, you are here and we appreciate it. And remember, if you miss a live broadcast, all of our programs are archived on youtube.com on the Jews for United for Democracy and Justice channel. A couple of hours after each program, the discussions are posted and available to be viewed at your leisure. After the programs that Janice just mentioned, we continue on September 27th when we hear from one of our most popular guests, Sarah Longwell. She's an expert on voting trends and Republican politics. She's the publisher of The Bulwark, and she'll discuss the recent polling that suggests that Trump remains an overwhelming favorite of the Republican base, despite all his legal troubles. She will tell us what's hype and what isn't, and she'll be in dialogue with Warren Aldi. The following week, Greg Bluestein of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution will join us. Greg is an award-winning political journalist for the Constitution, who's also an NBC and MSNBC contributor. He authored the 2022 book, Flipped: How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. He's an expert on all things political in the Peach State, and that'll be on October 4th. I now have the pleasure of introducing an old friend, member of the Jews United Executive Committee and a pillar of Los Angeles politics for nearly 50 years. He's been a city councilman and a county supervisor with authority over a jurisdiction with nearly 10 million residents. That's more than 39 states' population. He's now a professor at UCLA, Zev Yaroslavsky. He'll introduce this evening's guest and our moderator. Zev?
Thank you, David. Thanks for reminding me it's been 50 years. Good evening to everyone and good day in Australia. We're honored this evening to have a true public servant who immigrated to the United States from Ukraine as a youngster, enlisted in the United States Army where he became a career officer and served our country with exceptional courage and integrity. Alexander Vindman served as a military attaché in both Kyiv and Moscow before moving to the White House and the National Security Council, where he served as Director of European Affairs. Alexander came to national attention in October 2019 when he testified before the United States Congress on the Trump-Ukraine scandal. His riveting account and detailed revelations of those events provided key evidence that led to the first impeachment of Donald Trump. Since his last appearance with us, he's visited Ukraine to assess the status of the brutal conflict launched by Russia and that is now more than a year and a half long. A lot has happened since then. His expertise on Russia and Ukraine make him one of the go-to people on all things Ukraine. His presence here tonight could not be more timely. And to lead the conversation this evening is a frequent interlocutor at America at Crossroads. Larry Mantle is the longtime host of Air Talk, National Public Radio's flagship news program on LAist, formerly known as KPCC. He has been awarded just about every award for excellence in his profession. At more than 30 years, he is the longest serving radio host in Southern California radio. And Larry is as trusted a journalist as there is, a person whom I've described as the Walter Cronkite of public radio. So Larry, I turn it over to you.
Zev, thank you so much. Really means a lot, those kind words coming from you, someone who served Angelenos for so many years, and I appreciate it very much. It means a lot. Thank you also to David and to Janice, to Mel Levine as well. It's such a pleasure to be able to come to you with these programs and with the extraordinary range of guests that are part of weekly viewing on America at a Crossroads. As we just heard from Zev, the timing could not be better for the retired Lieutenant Colonel to join us to talk about events in Ukraine. I'm looking forward to your questions for Alex Vindman later this hour. I ask, would you please put your location along with your first name in the Q&A with your question. It's just nice to share with others where you're watching the program and where your question is coming from. So please do that. We've had an extraordinary series of events just today in Ukraine, and yet again, the events of the day align with the program America at a Crossroads. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Kyiv to assess Ukraine's 3-month-old counteroffensive against Russian forces. He also announced $1 billion in new U.S. funding for Ukraine, including military and humanitarian aid. It's Blinken's 4th visit to the country, and concurrent with this visit, a Russian missile tore through an outdoor market in eastern Ukraine near the front line in the Donetsk region. It was one of the deadliest aerial attacks of the war. 17 people were killed today and at least 32 wounded. The price to the Ukrainian people is extraordinary, and we're going to be talking about what the human cost of the war is, as well as the U.S.'s role, of course, with aid. Alex, thank you so much for being with us this evening to talk about this important issue. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Larry. Looking forward to the conversation. Thank you, Zev, David, Janice, Jews United for Democracy and Justice, and the program America at a Crossroads. Looking forward to having this conversation after about 18 months or so. I think last time we spoke was in April of 2022.
That's great. And now you holder of a doctorate from Johns Hopkins in the intervening period. Congratulations on that. The Ukrainian counteroffensive is going slower than supporters had hoped. To what extent is Ukraine gaining ground? There's some who say it's employing a bite and hold strategy, and that maybe the gains are greater than would first be obvious. What do you think?
It sounds like you read General Nick Ryan's article in Foreign Affairs. There were different measures for success in an offensive. I think part of the strategy here, everybody's focused on kind of something that may not be the most relevant factor right now, the retaking of ground. I think that's the ultimate goal. The objective is to liberate Ukrainian territory, break the Russian land bridge connecting by land Russian territory to Crimea. But in order to get there, the intermediate objective, what in the military we'd call the center of gravity, is really destroying Russian ground formations. Reducing Russia's ability to overwatch very, very complex obstacles consisting of dragon's teeth, these kind of fortifications, tank ditches, minefields. That only really is effective if there are troops to do so. And Russia is losing scores of troops a day. Ukrainian estimates say about 500 troops a day. If you do that over the course of a month, that's 15,000 troops a month. That is a massive amount of losses. The Ukrainians are taking some losses too, not quite nearly as much, about a third or a fourth of those casualties, but still taking some significant casualties. But this is what's referred to as attritional warfare. So the Ukrainians are grinding down Russia's forces, making relatively modest gains territorially, but making significant gains in reducing Russia's combat power. We're now seeing the tipping point, what likely looks like the tipping point in this confrontation, where the Russians are just running out of the forces to be able to defend these positions. And the Ukrainians are starting to pick up critical pieces of territory, breaching obstacle belts, breaching defensive lines, and that will start to accelerate over the course. From my expectation is that it'll start to accelerate over the course of the coming weeks, and we'll see the Ukrainians actually hit some markers that'll probably be appealing to the general public.
Just to clarify, then, are you saying that what the Ukrainian counteroffensive is really designed to do is that degradation of troop numbers and fortifications? It's really not about gaining ground, or is the intent to gain ground, and you think that would be better delayed until more inroads are made into Russian military strength?
It's the latter. It's the fact that they ultimately do want to achieve territorial gains. The most notable would be reaching, let's say, the city of Melitopol, which would give them basically give them the ability to cut the land bridge. But you can't do that. There's no kind of magic trick that you can do. There's no quick lightning warfare that we in America got comfortable with after watching Desert Storm 1 and Desert Storm 2, where the U.S. was able to break through enemy lines and really advance on Baghdad. There is no silver bullet like that. The forces are much more closely matched. The Ukrainians don't have air power. It is a much more, and it's a very, very different kind of war. The Russians remain a formidable force. In order to achieve those territorial gains, you need to break the Russian military. And that's the phase that we're in. Even 2 months into this counteroffensive, we're still in this phase, but we're starting to see indications of a shift to the potential for maneuver warfare, for the Ukrainians to maneuver behind these fortifications and start to liberate larger swaths of territory.
What is the extent of Ukrainian offensive air power? We'll talk about air defenses in a moment, but offensive power from the air.
There is no conventional air power capability. There are no planes that the Ukrainians have per se. What the Ukrainians have done is they've innovated and taken kind of a relatively nascent technology, drone warfare, and applied it to a major ground war. They're producing hundreds and hundreds of drones that allow them to fly over mainly in two different areas, really. The tactical formations, these are what would be some footage that you see of drones flying over troops and dropping grenades. They've produced thousands of these types of drones. They've been quite effective at punishing Russian forces in defenses, observing where they are for artillery fire. So not conventional air power, but something improvised. And the other thing that they're doing, and these are the sensational attacks that you see now being launched against Moscow, closing down Russian air travel, closing down the airports, going after strategic bases where there are strategic bombers located, going after other critical infrastructure. And that's the strategic element of this drone warfare capability. But it is not the conventional air power that the US and the Western militaries have come to rely on, with fleets of F-16s, F-22s, F-35s that are able to achieve air dominance and basically allow the troops to move unimpeded, US troops to move in unimpeded wars. That's not the case. The Russians have advanced air defense capabilities that wouldn't even allow anything but maybe the most advanced air platforms like stealth fighters to fly. So this is just a very different war than what the West has experienced. Certainly very different than the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, different than Iraq, in the major combat operations phase. But the Ukrainians are improvising.
Alex, to what extent has Ukraine been able to fortify its air defenses?
Well, so Ukraine, through almost a miraculously effective capability, was able to first preserve its indigenous air defense capabilities. These are Soviet era air defenses. They were not destroyed on the ground. They were not destroyed in a lightning phase of the war in the first hours the way the Russians had expected. The Ukrainians had already perceived the oncoming Russian onslaught and repositioned them. That impeded Russia from flying freely over Ukrainian skies. Immediately, the Russians were taking losses, and they self-restricted themselves in flying their fighters into Ukrainian cities, going after critical infrastructure, going after command and control. Those types of things were not in play for the Russians. That has been further enabled by the provision of advanced Western air defense systems. Patriots, NASAMS, these are very, very capable. IRIS-Ts that are coming from Germany. These are extremely capable systems that basically allow, not only do they not allow Russian fighters to fly through, bombers to fly through, but they really reduce Russia's ability to attack with masses of cruise missiles, with masses of drones. And the more of these systems that come in, the less of the kinds of attacks that we saw today, against this urban civilian population, the less of those things that we'll see. The problem is that Ukraine has to make choices. It's the largest country in Europe. It has to make choices about defending critical infrastructure, has to make choices about defending strategic targets like the capital of Kiev, major bases, oil infrastructure and gas infrastructure to keep the economy going, airfields with planes that are able to launch, these long-range systems that have been donated by the West, these Storm Shadows and so forth. So in so doing, it has to take some risk somewhere. And unfortunately, that use tends to be smaller cities, frontline formations that don't get the kind of defenses that they need. The more capability that the West provides, the less Russia is going to be able to conduct these kinds of terror attacks.
You were in Ukraine just a couple of months ago, and just briefly, just first thing that impressed you when you were there, that maybe surprised you a little bit, seeing it on the ground or hearing of it firsthand. Secondly, something that caused you concern about your visit.
So I've been there twice since last we spoke. Last year was a much more precarious situation. Things were, we were past the Battle of Kiev, but the Russians had kind of regained their footing and had started to make gains in the east. And there were still, it was months before these liberations around Kharkiv area, around Kherson, and the Ukrainians hadn't demonstrated yet their offensive capability. I went back there a year later. The mission included delivering a whole bunch of aid to Ukrainian military formations, cold weather gear for the coming winter, and had a chance to engage with the entirety of the Ukrainian national security establishment. And in exchange of views, I offered them my views. They told me what was going on, because I also talked to the White House and the Department of Defense and so forth. I'd say the biggest thing was the population in general is probably more optimistic than the military professionals. The population has in a way been trained to believe that Ukrainians will work miracles. I think that that's true. The Ukrainians have, in fact, kind of worked miracles on the battlefield, destroying the second most powerful military in the world. But they're cautious. And the reason is that they're dealing with a formidable enemy and massive defenses. What the Ukrainian leadership told me is they actually are much better and more effective at contending with Russia's most elite fighting formations, airborne forces. This is the battles around Bakhmut, when they were taking ground away from Russian airborne forces, but with less prepared defenses than they are in the south, where the so-called Surovikin line was established, with massive minefields and trenches and all sorts of different fortifications. It was a much slower go until recently they started to accelerate some of those gains. So I think that they are cautiously optimistic. I think it's a razor's edge to a certain extent. Let's say if the U.S. and the West had done more to provide the engineering assets that were promised, because there's a difference between promises made and promises delivered. If there was more done with regards to providing advanced aircraft, instead of doing this, having this conversation about F-16s now, this conversation should have occurred a year ago. The Ukrainians would have been in a much more comfortable position to be able to wage this offensive. I think it's going to be pretty close. And I think it's unfortunately the Ukrainians are not going to be in a position to make this land decisive blows against the Russian military, which means that this war is likely to continue on through 2024. We have another year and a half of war.
Alex, let's talk about what a victory would look like. You signed on to that statement with 46 total policy advisors, including yourself, calling for supplying significantly more weapons to Ukraine, affirming Ukraine's entry into NATO. But what does a victory look like? That letter mentions, if I'm not mistaken, return to 1991 borders for Ukraine, which means Crimea is part of Ukraine, not Russia. And I'm just trying to imagine, how does Putin tolerate a loss of that extent? And how do you see him reacting if that was to be achieved?
So Putin's biggest imperatives are regime survival. He is more than prepared to live and fight another day than risk his regime in a major way. If push comes to shove, and again, unfortunately, it's not going to be the end of this offensive by the Ukrainians, but when the Ukrainians do breach this land bridge, get to the Sea of Azov, and cut off Crimea and start making their way towards liberating territory, including threatening Crimea, Putin is going to have to make some tough decisions. Does he want to roll back his, extremely inflated views of what Russia controls? They annexed 4 different territories in addition to Crimea. Just recently, in the spring, they annexed 4 territories. He's going to have to accept that. He runs out of military capacity to continue to fight. The alternative is attempt to mobilize the entirety of Russia's society, draw on hundreds of thousands of troops, and deal with the consequences, the internal instability, when we know there is already a significant level of internal stability. So does he want to do it? No, but he might be in a position where he has no choice. What he does in that case is he negotiates for what he can hang on to. I think I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs actually several months back about saying that the endgame is frankly a negotiation about him attempting to retain Crimea. So he could give up most of what he wants, but his ultimate objective is to try to hang on to Crimea and retain control over Crimea. And that is an acceptable outcome for him.
And do you think President Zelensky would accept that? Because hasn't he said publicly that he wouldn't agree to that?
So there's there's kind of the forward-facing posturing, and then there's the reality. I think the fact is that President Zelensky would be loath to accept those conditions. And I think if he did, he would do it under certain conditions where Russia at least partially and temporarily demilitarizes Crimea, so it's not a consistent thorn and a security threat to Ukraine. There has to be some sort of template where there is a referendum in Ukraine that includes people that were forced to flee Ukraine after 2014. Imagine a Minsk type format, except it would be in favor of Ukraine and in a position where Ukraine has the ability to see a path towards peacefully regaining control of Crimea. For Putin, this would be an acceptable outcome because Crimea wouldn't be immediately under threat. He would be able to, believe that he has the means to retain Crimea for years at minimum. And I think there is a compromise to be had over Crimea. It is not anywhere near an optimal situation, primarily because it would still be a security threat to Ukraine, but it would be probably acceptable because it would end a war that's inflicting thousands of casualties and killing the best and brightest in Ukraine.
And on the Russian side, and perhaps I have a caricature of Vladimir Putin in my mind, but it seems to me his regime is so coupled to a narrative of him as the strong man. And so with a setback that you're talking about as the ultimate outcome of this war, how does he fend off people who would be rivals, for example, perceiving him as deeply weakened as a result of this kind of a setback, even if Russia retains Crimea? So
that's an interesting, it's a bit of an interesting theory that recent events have kind of proven to be maybe a bit flawed or overly simplistic. I hope that didn't sound entirely provocative.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
certainly
So-
didn't take it personally.
Yeah. So the reason I say this is that Putin is the undisputed ruler of Russia. He is not really fundamentally challenged. He has not started to leverage the repressive tools of the Russian security state. There are, the capacity for camps and suppression is vast. He hasn't really had to face any significant protests. There were relatively mild protests when the war started, and the Russians suppressed those protests, those political protests, brutally. Putin continues to enjoy quite a bit of popularity. He's still perceived as a strongman. So he's not. I mean, between his support and the fact that he hasn't even tapped his repressive potential, he's not under enormous amounts of pressure, even if he has to wheel back some of his objectives. But there's another key component here, and I wrote this article in the Daily Beast just I guess a couple weeks ago. It was a hot take on Prigozhin and the murder of Prigozhin.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about how Prigozhin factors into this.
So this is an interesting component here. Prigozhin embodied the threat from the ultra-nationalists, the war hawks, the folks that wanted Putin to do more. And Prigozhin challenged a system where Putin, his elite circle included the Minister of Defense, one of his closest allies, and the Chief of the General Staff. And in challenging the system, Putin basically ultimately, after letting things get out of control, Prigozhin with his march and seizure of Rostov and the Southern Military District headquarters, his march towards Moscow, Putin had to react. He had to kind of sue for peace. He had to have Lukashenko moderate the conversation. Weeks later, actually, no, correction, 2 months later, almost to the day, I think it was to the day, Putin had Prigozhin murdered. And at the same time, he had Surovikin fired. He had other war hawks like Igor Girkin, the guy that, this colonel that led the war effort in 2014, arrested. Other propagandists have been arrested. Ultra-nationalist propagandists have been arrested. So he is cracking down on this far-right faction that has been critical of his conduct of the war. There is no left-leaning, liberal faction that he has to contend with. He really has to suppress the ultra-right, and he has a lot of freedom of maneuver. So what he's done in a way is he's kind of set up, expanded his bandwidth, expanded his options to pivot in any number of different directions, like he did when Prigozhin was marching on the Capitol. He said he denounced Prigozhin in the morning as a traitor and a criminal, and then pardoned him, later on, or a day later. He is able to turn on a dime because he's unchallenged. He's, again, still popular and unchallenged. So I think we overstate the real threats to Putin, even if he has to do a drastic about-face with this war effort in Ukraine.
All right. Critics of U.S. financial support of Ukraine argue it's unrealistic that Ukraine is really going to be able to retake the territory seized by Russia. And so you've got many people who are arguing that there should be negotiations now with Putin, that is the time to do it. What's your response to that? To those who say, $24 billion more is being asked, and this is the appetite is not here in the long term to keep funding Ukraine.
So first of all, every bit of polling, and I look at it carefully, still suggests overwhelming support for Ukraine. A lot of these polls are about the way you ask a question. You ask a question with a lot of pollsters ask a question with a desired outcome. There's a client that's looking for a particular kind of narrative to draw on. So, but an analysis of the polls themselves shows overwhelming support for Ukraine. It's bipartisan, even with kind of the capture of the Republican establishment by Trumpism. Ukraine remains quite popular. So I think what we're contending with is a couple of factions. One are the kind of the Trumpist wing that wants to cut and run on Ukraine because that's the temperament of the president. And there's a narrative around, Russia is the good guy, Ukraine is the bad guy. It's very kind of a bizarre view of the world. And then there is another faction that is highly invested in this notion that somehow we could quickly come around to a negotiated solution. You have to have willing parties in that negotiation. The US does not set the terms, cannot dictate the terms. It is politically untenable for the US to withdraw support from Ukraine. Certainly, a Biden administration can't do that without taking a huge amount of heat because of the public support for Ukraine. So then, how do you actually materialize this negotiation? Putin has zero appetite to negotiate. He keeps his rhetoric is entirely grandiose. He continues to double down on Ukraine being populated by Nazis. He had this whole narrative just within the past couple of days about Zelensky, being Jewish, but it's still a Nazi state and so forth. And the Russians haven't given up on this idea of conquering Ukraine. Reality hasn't quite set in. And the Ukrainians are feeling relatively comfortable, like I said. So how do you go about actually driving that kind of negotiations? Unrealistic. Now, to the other side of this argument, whether it's in U.S. interests, I contend that it is probably the most important investment we can make in our security. It buys us a deterrence for China, potentially waging war in Taiwan. I think most analysts would agree that there is a follow-on, a knock-on effect from this war and Western support for Ukraine, and the deterrent value that has on China and the cost that China would suffer if it pursued a war against Taiwan. Both
because we would jump in is the idea that we would defend Taiwan?
Well, for a couple of different reasons. One is it is unsure that it could win militarily. If Russia can't win in Ukraine, how is China going to conduct a successful amphibious operation? Two, the sanctions, and three, of course, the war or war with the West. Those aspects are all deterrents. There's also a deterrent, frankly, on other aggressive regimes that believe in what might makes right and the ability and the willingness to use force. So those are kind of big picture. Then there's the undergirding of the international order, the rules-based international order that believes in this idea, that countries don't attack other countries for territorial acquisition. It's a rule that's kind of been fundamental and held since after World War II. It was why the UN was established. But the most practical and most important one, yes, we support the humanitarian cause of supporting democracy over fighting off authoritarianism. But for U.S. security, raw gains for U.S. security, it's pennies on the dollar. We've provided about 3% of U.S. defense budget to Ukraine, and the benefit has been destruction of 50% of Russia's combat power. We put in tens of billions of dollars to contend with the reality of having to fight Russia. But now we don't have to, because the Ukrainians have destroyed the Russian military. So all those investments that we would continue to pour tens of billions of dollars into, we don't have to worry about it. The Russians have been cleared off the board. We could now apply them to deter China, apply them to other problem sets. So it's a really, really kind of frugal, economical contribution to our security to continue to support Ukraine and make sure that Russia doesn't snatch a victory from the jaws of defeat.
What if one of the principles of a negotiated agreement was that Ukraine would not join NATO, and that was something it gave up in exchange for the majority of the territory seized being returned to Ukraine control? Would that be an acceptable negotiated deal?
It wouldn't be for the Ukrainians. And the reason it wouldn't be for the Ukrainians is because they recognize that there is no such deal to be made with Putin. There is no foregoing NATO membership that forestalls a future Russian aggression when Russia reconstitutes, rebuilds, and believes it has the strength to attack Ukraine. The only long-term security guarantee for Ukraine is NATO membership. And the reason is that Russia is not the least bit interested in provoking confrontation with NATO. So what we could, the theory would also be that somehow Russia would just give up its territory for some pledge from the Ukrainians for not joining NATO. These things are just not realistic possibilities. the Russians are not going to trust that the Ukrainians abide by that pledge if they withdraw from Ukrainian territory. And then,
So-
and the Ukrainians won't trust the Russians to not attack them in the future.
Alex, what kind of a military gain would Ukraine have to make that Russia would agree to Ukraine joining NATO, and that Russia would cede all the territory it seized except Crimea?
Well, so there's no military, these are all in opposition to Russia's wishes. The way this war winds down is not through some sort of kind of a negotiation short of the destruction of large portions of the Russian military. The Russians will continue to fight as long as they have the means to do so. If Russia has the ability to hang on to territory, if Russia has the will to mobilize tens of thousands, likely if they do another mobilization, it's going to be hundreds of thousands of troops. They'll keep pushing as long as they can. The only way this starts to wind down is in a scenario in which Ukraine destroys Russian military combat power, in which Ukraine is able to break Russia's land bridge and put Russia on the horns of a dilemma. The horns of the dilemma would be to lose everything that they have, meaning including jeopardizing Crimea, or start to test the waters for negotiation. I think that there's a reasonable chance that we'll see the testing of negotiations at the end of this year. And it's going to be on the heels of Ukrainian gains, military gains. It is not going to be because the Russians come to their senses, somehow recognize that they can't achieve their military aims. They're at least going to hang on until 2024, because for Putin, all the incentives are there to figure out if he gets a more favorable political outcome in the U.S. in the 2024 election with a Trump or a DeSantis or something of that nature coming to power.
I want to get to our viewer questions momentarily, but what are the NATO members' appetites for continuing to assist, even if American political opinion is still behind Ukraine?
There's still wide-ranging support, European support for the support to Ukraine. I would say that there is a bit of a sea change in perceptions around Eurasia from European powers, France and Germany. There was an inordinate amount of wishful thinking around the ability to cooperate with Russia and the ability and a willingness to sacrifice other relationships, including with other regional heavyweights like Ukraine, in order to ameliorate, to ingratiate with Putin to achieve these kind of far-fetched political aims. I think the Germans and the French both have a much more sober appreciation of Russia. They have a much more sober appreciation of Putin. And I think the fact is that while they're not willing to do everything that it takes, they're still, Germany still resistant on providing critical capabilities. The appetite for sanctions is not as robust as it probably needs to be. There is no going back to kind of a status quo ante, a status quo before the war. My doctoral dissertation was on U.S. policy towards Russia and Ukraine since 1991. My conclusions were quite simple. We had the West as a whole, the U.S. specifically, had some wishful thinking about what couldn't be achieved with Russia. A purely aspirational or highly aspirational policy on a whole host of different objectives that we could potentially reach with Putin, whether that's climate change, whether that's arms control, whether that's security enhancing activities. Those were not going to be in the cards because Putin had a different view of the world. And instead, what we had to forego is investing in European security, investing in places like Ukraine, especially after the Orange Revolution, where there was a hard pivot towards European integration. And we didn't do that because we didn't want to upset Putin and Russia.
Let's take some viewer questions. Doug asks, what significance do you ascribe to the removal of Ukrainian Defense Minister Reznikov, and how endemic is corruption in Ukraine?
So corruption is a perennial problem in Ukraine. It's been a challenge for Ukraine for decades. In part, one of the reasons, one of the legitimate rationales for why the U.S. underinvested in Ukraine was because of corruption, and the Ukrainians were oftentimes, especially early on, prior to the Orange Revolution, particularly unreliable partners that couldn't be trusted to be good stewards of our partnership or our resources. But the country has made, that's all that is to say that is in Ukraine's past. Ukraine has made major strides in attempting to root out some corruption, huge strides since 2014, major reforms. President Zelensky has taken pretty major steps also. There are still entrenched interests there, oligarchs that control swaths of the economy. Corruption, within the officialdom is a problem, but it's not the same as it was, and the country's making progress.
And do you think
that's just
go ahead.
just the first part of it? So the reason, so corruption isn't the only reason that Reznikov was removed. There have been some scandals. There have been a couple of scandals percolating over food prices and food purchases. But under this war, Zelensky has made it clear that Ukraine will be a good steward of Western resources. There has not been any major scandal. Shockingly, there has not been any major scandal with the donation of Western resources, whether it be US or European, to Ukraine. So there have been some internal corruption scandals. There have been, I think, mishandling of civilian donated funds, humanitarian funds, but the government dollars that have come through have been scrupulously accounted for. So I think that's only a small portion. Corruption is not the real crux of why Reznikov was forced out. I think that we are seeing a kind of and potentially a effort to improve the leadership of the Ministry of Defense through another trusted agent.
Elaborate, please.
So the incoming Minister of Defense is pretty well regarded. He's a fluent English speaker. He is considered a honorable businessman. He has significant ties in the U.S. He funds a program at Stanford that my friend Mike McFall manages, and he is, by many accounts, I've only had very transactional interactions with him, but by many accounts, he is considered to be a very effective leader and manager. So I think I don't want to say anything negative about Reznikov, but I think this is intended to be an upgrade for the leadership of the Ministry of Defense.
And do you think the fact that those procurement scandals that you talked about earlier did come to light, and Zelensky apparently acted against the people responsible, do you think that sent an effective message about corruption, or is there always going to be people looking to make a buck unethically?
I think it's both. I think the fact is that this is part of the way people were brought up, especially the older generation, about graft is kind of just part of the system. So there's going to, until that it works its way out of the system, out of the body of Ukraine, it's going to be an issue. I think the fact is that the Ukrainians are dealing with this harshly. There are people that are kind of criticizing whether Zelensky should move in this direction, but there's an idea of making corruption a national security offense, elevating the punishment for corruption. I think that's supposed to warn off other corrupt agents, other corrupt practices. But I think he was, obviously trying to send the message that Ukraine is making strides, is improving its governance, and there's more to be done. I don't want to understate the mountains to climb, but the Ukrainians have made major strides. And frankly, if I was an investor, maybe this is a good testament to where Ukraine is. I would seriously be looking at opportunities to invest in Ukraine. It's challenging. You have to be very careful, but I think there's an opportunity to invest in Ukraine, certainly in the reconstruction phase.
We have Susan who asks, what impact will the grain embargo have on Russia's standing in the developing world?
So Russia will probably hold on this a grain embargo like they did before, when they embargoed grain before the grain deal. They thought that somehow that was going to generate pressure on Ukraine, to negotiate, generate pressure on the West to pressure Ukraine to negotiate. That obviously didn't work out very well. There ended up being a grain deal. Russia is now backed out of that grain deal. I think there's a bit of latitude for Russia to do that for another month or two before it really becomes an acute issue. There is a high degree of grain flow by land through rail networks, and Russia is definitely selling its grain at a premium. But I would be surprised if there is not another grain deal in the late fall, kind of early winter timeframe, just in time. But right now the Russians are putting the squeeze on to maximize profits, to maximize pressure. The standing for Russia it is one of the mysteries of Russia's operations in the southern hemisphere, that they are still considered a good actor by so many different countries in Africa, in South Asia. Somehow the Russians, a propaganda machine, has been so effective as to build Russia as anti-colonial, when it was probably one of the proto-colonial, kind of one of the first European colonial empires. It just did it domestically in Eurasia, colonizing vast tracts of Eurasia. But somehow that narrative carries weight, because a lot of these countries that they have good relationships with had to deal with their own colonial legacies with Western European powers, and Russia supported them in their struggle to fend off colonialism. So there's still some goodwill. I think it's one of those things. It's perishable and with an expiration date, and I don't see Russia enjoying this kind of popular sentiment,
Okay.
indefinitely. But for the time being, it still has that cachet.
U.S. officials say North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is likely going to meet with Putin next week in Vladivostok. Russia needs more ammunition, which North Korea could potentially supply. And this leads to a question from Sid, who's watching. Sid asks, besides Iran and North Korea, what other countries are assisting Russia? Is China?
China is not assisting Russia in a major kind of way. First, I guess the biggest thing that China is doing is it has a robust trade with Russia. Oil and gas flows are expanding, and that bolsters the Russian budget to continue to wage war. There are dual-use technologies that come across from China to Russia that help the military-industrial complex produce resources, but it's not like the West and its support of Ukraine. It's not in the form of direct military material. There is abundant evidence that kind of non-lethal equipment has made it in with regards to body armor and helmets and things of that nature, but it's not bullets, it's not munitions and things of that nature. China hasn't gone there yet. It would obviously be disastrous if it did. Really, Russia is relying on Iran. It is looking to expand its military trade relationship with DPRK, with North Korea. And that could actually it probably won't be decisive, but it could have an impact on the battlefield.
Okay.
The North Koreans have massive stockpiles of artillery ammunition. And that's what the Russians are starting to run short of.
Alex, I have several really excellent questions from viewers, so let's try and
quickly.
take them as rapidly as we can. Philip asks, will the F-16s that Ukrainians will soon get make a difference?
There is no silver bullet. Every bit of capability is important. The F-16s will, with the proper armaments, will allow the Ukrainians to push back Russian air power further behind the border. It'll inhibit Russia from using its planes to bomb Ukrainian troops. It'll provide air cover, allow Ukraine to destroy Russian helicopters, which will be critical. Those Russian helicopters are attacking Ukrainian armored formations. And that with the air defense capabilities will allow Ukraine to get better command of the skies. It's an important capability
Okay.
in conjunction with a bunch of other things that we're providing.
Rose asks, is the Wagner Group of any military significance now, and what about their actions elsewhere?
It is no longer a factor on the battlefield in Ukraine. It is still going to be a major nuisance in Africa and in Syria, basically acting as mercenaries supporting authoritarian regimes. But it's not going to be a factor in the war between Russia and Ukraine.
Do we know who's running Wagner?
Well, ultimately, it's the Ministry of Defense that's running Wagner now.
Oh, okay. All right. Mike asks, what impact would a Trump victory in 2024 have on the US's posture with Europe?
It would be a disaster. I think it's well documented that Trump has an eye on withdrawing the US from NATO, not because NATO is not paying its dues, but because this has been, this is one of those, I didn't lose the 2020 election mantras. NATO is bad. There's not a lot of reason behind it, but he has in his head that this is an important thing to do. And I think it's going to it may, it's hard to say come irreversibly damaged because countries have long-term relationships, but it's going to have a huge impact on US relationships with democracies around the world.
Let's see, we have a question. Tom asks, do we have the capacity to produce munitions for us and for Ukraine's needs?
We have a large military industrial enterprise. We never planned to arm ourselves for major combat operations, as well as a ally to wage a major war against another superpower. So we have to make some adjustments to our industrial base. Our industrial base had to do that, frankly, no matter what, because we were under resourcing in munitions, we were under resourcing critical capabilities. So Ukraine has kind of pointed the way that we need to make some major investments in our own defense apparatus. But we can do both. The reason is that we're a $24 trillion economy. We're the most powerful country in the world, and we are buying security for ourselves by supporting Ukraine. We are buying security for NATO and for our most important alliance, which is with Europe, our massive trading partner. So it is an extremely important investment in US security to continue to support Ukraine with anything and everything that they need to win.
Robert asks, what's your estimate of the range of Ukrainian casualties?
It's a very sensitive issue, but it's tens of thousands of casualties. The Ukrainians don't often like to talk about it, but it's probably approaching the six-figure range.
Elizabeth asks, if Putin falls, would chaos in Russia be worse than under Putin's leadership?
It's hard to imagine how it could possibly be worse. We went from a ruler that's been in charge of Russia for 23 years with peaceful relations to degrading to the brink of at least Putin regularly threatening and his elites regularly threatening nuclear war. I'm not sure how much worse it can get. I think the fact is that you have the same fundamental constraints on anybody else that comes into Russia. There is going to be an urgency for regime survival. So having a direct confrontation with NATO is mutually assured destruction. So I think a Russia after Putin may not change fundamentally, but it's going to get better because it would be a weaker leader. It will be a leader that has less control over and less repressive tools potentially to allow at least the development of alternative factions and maybe even liberal democracy. That's a long ways away. That's a generation away. But there's no possibility of that under Putin. Post Putin, I think that possibility could start to emerge.
Robert asks a personal question. What is your brother doing?
So he found himself in much the same situation I did, in a lot of ways validating my decision to kind of, I was forced out after my promotion was delayed. I could have stayed on and held up the promotions for hundreds and hundreds of officers. I decided that wasn't good, that would be harmful to my friends, but also to U.S. national security. So I left the military service and allowed the promotions to move forward. Eugene stayed on another year. He was kind of ostracized, banished to kind of a far corner, and with really little prospects of the advancement, the way our careers were moving before Trump corruption. So he's out. He's working with me on a bunch of humanitarian projects. I've raised $11.5 million for Ukraine. I'm working on trying to advance demining efforts, veterans care in Ukraine, a whole host of different projects. And he's working with the State Department for Russian war crimes accountability. So, he's doing okay.
A final question, this related, Carl asks your thoughts on Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville's hold on military promotions.
So I alluded to it, briefly. I withdrew from the military. I was fired by Trump. My promotion was impeded. I withdrew, because it was part of my duty. I mean, I wasn't going to impede a bunch of promotions. Tommy Tuberville is doing the exact opposite. He's holding up hundreds and hundreds of military promotions, jeopardizing U.S. national security, undercutting readiness, affecting soldiers, spouses, children that can't settle into schools now potentially have to can't take the jobs that they had arranged. And he's doing this because he's politicizing the military. That guy's a dirtbag. And I take it personally because I know friends that are affected by this. It makes me extremely angry to hear him say things like it's not affecting readiness. It is horrible. But I think the US is moving to turn the page. I am optimistic about 2024. I think there is a broader rejection of extremism. And I'm doing my part to contribute to the effort to make sure that we have a democracy and that we could turn the page on Trump and Trumpism, and this country continues to move forward towards that more perfect union.
And if you don't mind, we'll let that stand as your close. That's a very strong way to wrap up our conversation. Alex, thank you so much for joining us on America to Crossroads. It's been so enlightening, the experiences that you've had that you could bring home to us, and your analysis along with that experience, very meaningful. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate it. Excellent conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we thank you, of course, for tuning in for another America to Crossroads. These are the kinds of guests that come your way every Wednesday at 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern time. And next week, America to Crossroads with another terrific pair of guests. It'll be Ron Brownstein, political analysis. He does it writing for The Atlantic. You see him on CNN, and he'll be joined by Never Trumper pundit Bill Kristol, the two of them in conversation about what else, American politics. That program is next Wednesday, September 13th. Once again, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern. I just want to remind you, if you appreciate these programs, because I know so many of you are regular viewers of this series, please seriously consider a tax-deductible contribution to either of the two organizations that put these on each and every week, Community Advocates, Inc., or Jews United for Democracy and Justice. Either one of those organizations' websites, they're both nonprofits, and your contribution to support the series is tax deductible. Thank you so much. Have a terrific rest of your evening.